A man stands at the edge of what was once the Tabur Basin. His grandfather died here. His great-grandfather killed Harkonnens here. And now, where the silica sand once sang under the moonlight, there is grass. Soft, green, whispering grass. He kneels, he runs his fingers through it, and for reasons he cannot name, he weeps. This man is Fremen, or rather, he is what the Empire still calls Fremen. He wears the still suit only for ceremony now, and the ceremony is for tourists. The tourists pay in Solaris to watch him perform the way. They smile, they take recordings, they call him magnificent. He has never killed a sandworm. He has never tasted true thirst. He has never drunk the water of the dead. He is a museum piece in a costume his grandfather would have recognized as sacred. And he weeps because somewhere in the marrow of his bones, he understands what the historians have been too polite to say out loud. The Fremen did not lose a war. The Fremen won every war they ever fought. They conquered the known universe in the name of a young duke from Caladan, and they planted their banners on 12,000 worlds. They were unstoppable, untamable, the deadliest infantry the Empire had ever seen. And yet, they are gone. This is the story of how a people died from victory. To understand what was lost, we have to understand what they were. And to understand what they were, we have to understand what made them. The Fremen were not born. The Fremen were forged. Arrakis, Dune, the desert planet that the imperial cartographers once dismissed as a wasteland, surface temperatures that boiled flesh, winds that could strip a man of his skin in minutes, sandstorms that traveled at speeds approaching 700 kilometers an hour, carrying enough static charge to disable a guild lighter from low orbit. And beneath it all, the makers, Shai-Hulud. The great worms, some of them 400 meters long, ancient as the planet itself. Gods that ate cities and shrugged off armies. Survival on Arrakis was not a project, it was a religion. The Fremen learned to walk without rhythm, so the worms would not hear them. They learned to capture a single drop of water from their own breath, recycling it through still suits that turned sweat and even urine into life. A Fremen could survive in the open desert for weeks on a thimble of moisture. They greeted strangers with a ritual offering of water, because water was the only currency that mattered. And a man who shared his water was a man who shared his soul. What the Offworlders never grasped was the secret hidden inside this hardness. The hardness was not the price of survival. The hardness was the gift. When you live in a place where every breath is rationed, every step is calculated, every glance is a potential ambush, you become something the soft worlds cannot produce. You become awake. You become deliberate. You become, in the truest sense of the word, present. The Fedaykin, the death commandos of Stilgar's tribe, did not train for war. They trained for nothing, because their entire lives were already war. War with thirst, war with heat, war with the worms, war with the Harkonnens, who hunted them like vermin from sky and sand alike. By the time a Fremen child was 12 standard years old, he had already killed. By the time he was 16, he had already buried a brother in the deep desert, harvested the moisture from the body, and recited the funeral words for the water that the tribe could now reclaim. There is a phrase in the old Fremen tongue, mush mush. It means roughly, the necessity that makes meaning. The desert was not just their home, it was the mush mush. It was the pressure that turned them from clay into diamond. Now, consider what this meant for their inner lives. When everything you do has weight, when every ritual carries the possibility of death, the spiritual world becomes inseparable from the physical one. A crysknife was not a weapon. It was a tooth pulled from the mouth of a god. The water in your tribe's reservoir was not a resource. It was the collective soul of every ancestor who had ever lived, distilled and waiting for the day the Lisan al-Gaib would call them forth to bloom Arrakis into a paradise. Even their dreams were shaped by the dryness. The Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers who infiltrated the Sietches reported that Fremen dreams contained images so dense with meaning that they could not be properly translated into Galach. To dream as a Fremen was to be in conversation with the planet itself. This was the people Paul Muad'Dib walked among when he came down from the south after the death of his father. This was the army he inherited, and the universe had no idea what was coming. There is one more thread we have to pull before we go further, because the seeds of the Fremen extinction were planted long before Paul Atreides ever took his first breath. They were planted by a man named Pardot Kynes. Kynes was an imperial planetologist sent to Arrakis to assess its commercial potential. What he found there did not impress the Padishah Emperor. What he found there changed Kynes himself. He saw that the desert was not dead. He saw the dew collectors of the Dawnside dunes. He saw the saltwater traces that suggested a hidden aquifer system. And most importantly, he saw the Fremen thriving, where the Empire said no human should be able to live. So he asked himself a question that would eventually erase them. What if Arrakis could be green? He brought this dream to the Sietches, and the Fremen, beautiful and tragic in equal measure, embraced it. They began to hoard water, not for survival, but for a vision. They began to plant ground cover in secret canyons. They began to dream of the day when the desert would bloom and they would walk under open skies without still suits and feel rain on their faces. They did not understand, they could not have understood, that the rain they were praying for would be the same rain that washed them out of existence. Pardot Kynes was their prophet of paradise. And paradise, as it turns out, is a kind of slow extinction. When Paul Atreides became emperor, he did not invent the Greening Project. He inherited it. The Fremen had been working toward terraformation for 2 generations under Leto Kynes, Pardot's son. They had palmeries hidden in canyon walls. They had connaughts running beneath the rock. They had a target. 3% vegetation cover, sustained over a 50-year period, would tip the planet into a self-sustaining ecological cascade. Once that threshold was crossed, the desert would retreat on its own. After the Jihad began, the Fremen had everything they needed to accelerate this dream. They had imperial resources. They had the spice income of an entire empire. They had Paul Muad'Dib, the prophet himself, blessing the work as the fulfillment of religious destiny. So they planted faster than any planetologist had ever dreamed possible. Within 10 standard years of Paul's ascension, the southern polar regions were already showing dense vegetation. Within 20, the equatorial belt had its first standing rivers in 20,000 years. Within 50, when Leto II came to power, you could fly over Arrakis at low altitude and see entire forests where his great-grandfather had only seen sand. It was a miracle. It was the greatest ecological achievement in the history of the Imperium. Every news bulletin in every system spoke of it as a triumph of human ingenuity, but the Fremen were dying. Let me say that again, because it matters. The Fremen were dying, and almost nobody noticed, because the dying did not look like death. It looked like prosperity. The deep Sietches, the ones that had been Fremen for thousands of years, began to lose their populations. Why would a young man stay in a cave when there were now city apartments with running water? Why would a young woman risk a worm ride when there were air cars that could take her over the same distance in an afternoon? The mush-mush, the necessity that gave meaning, was being subtracted from their lives one comfort at a time. And as the mush-mush vanished, so did the practices it had sustained. Still suits became ceremonial, then they became theatrical, then they became absent. By the 2nd generation after the Jihad, most Fremen living in the cities of Arrakis and Carthage did not own a still suit at all. They thought of still suits the way a citizen of old Earth thought of a chainmail tunic. Quaint, historical, something their grandfathers wore in faded portraits. The water discipline collapsed next. There's a moment recorded in the Imperial Chronicles, perhaps the most quietly devastating moment in all of Dune history, where a young Fremen woman, perhaps 19 years old, was observed by an off-world journalist drinking from a glass of water and leaving half of it on the table when she stood up. She just walked away from it. Her great-grandmother would have killed a man for that water. Her great-grandmother would have stood over the corpse of that man and reclaimed every milliliter of moisture from his body, because water was sacred. Water was the dead. Water was the future. And here was her descendant, leaving it on a table to evaporate, because water was now just water. That is what extinction looks like. Not a battle, not a massacre. A glass of water left half full. So what filled the void? What did the Fremen become once the desert stopped making them? This is where the warriors became bureaucrats. Paul's Jihad needed soldiers. The Fremen provided them, 12 billion of them by some estimates, sweeping across the known universe in a campaign of conversion that left 61 billion dead and 90 planets sterilized. It was, by most measures, the greatest atrocity in human history. But the Jihad had to end. It always had to end. And when it did, those soldiers had to come home. What was waiting for them? Not the desert. The desert was retreating year by year. Not the Sietch, because the Sietches were emptying. Not even by the time most of them returned, Muad'Dib himself, because he had walked into the desert blind and disappeared into legend. What was waiting for them was a job. The new imperial government, headquartered on Arrakis, under the regency of Alia and later under Leto II, needed administrators. It needed enforcers. It needed religious officials to manage the swelling pilgrim economy. And so the Fremen, who had once been the deadliest fighting force in the universe, were given titles. They became Kizara priests. They became revenue collectors for the Spacing Guild. They became border guards at the Hajj checkpoints, where pilgrims from across the empire arrived in their billions to pay homage to the dead prophet. A Fedaykin who had killed 100 Sardaukar at the Battle of Arrakis now spent his days stamping pilgrim visas. You can imagine, perhaps, what this did to the soul. The honor culture of the Fremen had been built on the immediate, visible, undeniable consequences of action. You killed a man, his water joined the tribe. You betrayed a Sietch. You were tied to a stake, and your body was parceled out to your former brothers as a final lesson. There was no court. There was no appeal. There was only the deed and its weight. Bureaucracy, by its nature, dilutes the deed. It puts forms between you and the consequence. It puts committees between you and the choice. The same Fremen, who had once made every decision with the clarity of a knife at his throat, was now drafting policy memos about water tariffs. A strange phenomenon emerged in those decades. Fremen began to commit suicide in unprecedented numbers. Not in battle, where death had meaning, in their own homes, in their own offices, with drugs, with weapons, with the slow death of alcoholism and spice overdose. They were not dying because their bodies were broken. They were dying because their bodies could not figure out what to do in a world that did not need them. The commodification was almost worse than the suicides, because the suicides, at least, were honest. By the second generation, you could buy a crysknife in any market on Arrakis. Real ones, pulled from the mouths of dead worms, sold to tourists from Caladan and Gedi Prime as souvenirs. The Offworlders called this progress. The few old Fremen who remember the meaning of the blade called it desecration. But the old Fremen were getting rarer every year, and the merchants needed to eat. Sietch Tabur, where Stilgar had once been Naib, was opened to public tours within 40 years of Paul's ascension. Tourists could pay to walk through the very chambers where the Lisan al-Gaib had been received, where the water of life had been transmuted, where Chani had nursed the twins. They could buy holographic recordings of the rituals. They could pay extra for a guided tour led by an actor in a still suit. The actor was usually a young Fremen man who needed the work. He had memorized the ritual phrases from a textbook. He did not believe in them. He could not have believed in them. The phrases were about survival in a desert that no longer existed. This is what scholars now call the hollowing. A culture's external forms persist long after their internal meanings have evaporated. The shell looks the same. The shell sounds the same. But the creature inside is dead. And now, somewhere in this story, you must be wondering, surely there were Fremen who saw this happening. Surely some of them resisted. There were. There always are. And the resistance is the most heartbreaking part of the entire tragedy. The wild Fremen, as later historians would call them, were the small percentage of tribes that refused the urban migration. They kept their sietches. They kept their still suits. They kept their water discipline, their crysknives, their mush-mush. They watched the greening with growing horror, and many of them resisted it actively, sabotaging the wind traps that fed the gardens, attacking the planting crews, trying with everything they had to keep some part of Arrakis dry. They lost. They lost because they were outnumbered. They lost because the Empire had infinite resources, and they had only what they could carry. But mostly they lost because the rain itself was their enemy, and you cannot fight rain with a knife. By the time of Leto II, only a handful of authentic, deep desert tribes remained. Leto, who saw further than any human had ever seen, recognized what was being lost. And he made a choice that historians still argue about. He preserved them. He built a vast reserve in what remained of the deep desert, and he ordered the wild Fremen to live there as exhibits. He paid them. He gave them protection. He recorded their songs and their language and their rituals for the scholars of the Imperial Archive. He called them the Museum Fremen. The name is perhaps the most honest term ever applied to a dying culture. They were not warriors anymore. They were not survivors anymore. They were exhibits displayed in their natural habitat for the edification of an empire that had forgotten what they meant. The young Museum Fremen grew up performing rituals that had no functional purpose. They greeted visitors with the water ceremony, but the water came from imperial pipelines now, not from carefully harvested condensation. They walked the sand without rhythm, but there were no worms to hear them because the worms had been driven to near extinction by the moisture in the soil. They recited the names of their ancestors back to the time of Selim Wormrider, but they did so for an audience, not for themselves. There is footage from this period recovered from the archives of God Emperor Leto's reign. A young Museum Fremen man, perhaps 20 years old, performs the war dance for a group of off-world dignitaries. The dance is precise. The footwork is perfect. He has been trained in it since childhood. And at the end of the performance, when the dignitaries applaud, the camera catches his face for just a moment. His eyes are dead. He knows what he is. He knows that the gestures he is making meant something once to people who looked like him but were not him. He knows that he is the curator of his own culture's funeral. And he knows that there is nothing he can do about it because the culture cannot exist outside the conditions that made it, and those conditions are gone forever. This generation, the last truly indigenous generation of Fremen, became the most haunted population in the Imperium. They were not poor, they were not oppressed. By any material measure, they had better lives than their ancestors. They had medicine, they had food, they had safety, but they were the last witnesses. And the weight of being a witness, when you cannot save what you are witnessing, is its own kind of slow death. There is a particular sorrow that belongs only to this generation. The young Museum Fremen often spoke of feeling like ghosts in the wrong direction, not haunting the past, but being haunted by it. They would dream in fragments of a language none of their friends spoke. They would taste, in moments of stillness, an old grief whose source they could not name. The Bene Gesserit who studied them concluded that the Fremen psyche evolved over thousands of years for the deep desert, simply could not adapt to a generation in green parks and air-conditioned apartments. The mind expected a struggle that was no longer there and turned inward and chewed itself. So we come, finally, to the question we started with. Was the victory worth it? The historians are split. The economists tend to say yes, because the prosperity that followed was unprecedented. The galactic poverty rate dropped by 14% in the first century after the Jihad. Life expectancy on Arrakis itself rose from 47 standard years to 98. By every objective measure of human flourishing, the empire under Paul and Leto was richer, healthier, and longer lived than any human civilization that had come before. But the philosophers, and especially the few Fremen scholars who survived into the late period, asked a different question. They asked what it cost, and the answer, when you tally it honestly, is staggering. It cost a language. The Fremen tongue, the Chakobsa-derived dialect that had carried the wisdom of 100 generations, ceased to be spoken by native speakers within 3 centuries of Paul's coronation. The Imperial Archive preserved the grammar. Scholars learned it, but there was nobody left who dreamed in it. It cost a religion, not Muad'Dib's religion, which thrived for millennia, but the older one. The pre-Atreides spirituality that saw water as the soul of the dead and the desert as the cradle of meaning. That faith required the desert. The desert was gone. The faith went with it. It cost a way of being human. Remember the man at the start of this story, the one kneeling in the grass at Tabur, the one weeping for reasons he could not name. He weeps because he is the answer to Pardot Kynes' question. What if Arrakis could be green? It can be. It is. And the cost of that greenness is him, his unease, his unbelonging, his sense that the rituals he performs are a costume worn over a body that does not know what it is anymore. Pardot Kynes died in a spice blow before he could see his dream realized. Some Fremen scholars consider this a mercy. He never had to see what the paradise actually meant. He never had to watch his beloved people transform from forgers of legend into curators of legend. He never had to understand that the greatest gift he gave them, the dream of green, was also the slow poison that killed them. There is a parable that the late Museum Fremen used to tell, recorded by a Bene Gesserit anthropologist in the 700th year of the imperial calendar. It goes like this. A man finds a hawk in the desert. The hawk is fierce, free, deadly. The man takes the hawk home and begins to feed it. He keeps it in a cage where the wind cannot reach. He gives it the choicest meat. He protects it from the heat and the cold. The hawk grows fat. The hawk grows comfortable. The hawk forgets what it is. One day, the man opens the cage to show the hawk the open sky. The hawk does not fly. The hawk does not even know that the sky is calling it, because the hawk is no longer a hawk. The hawk is a creature in the shape of a hawk, kept by a man who once admired hawks and now admires only the shape of them. Ugh, that is the tragedy of the Fremen. The Empire admired their ferocity. The Empire wanted their bravery. The Empire built statues of them and named cities after them and called them the saviors of the human race. But the Empire also built their cage and called the cage a paradise and waited for the hawk to fly. The hawk did not fly. In the final analysis, the most chilling truth of the Fremen story is not that they were defeated. They were not. They never lost a battle that mattered. The Sardaukar could not break them. The Harkonnens could not exterminate them. The combined navies of the Landsraad could not contain them when they marched in Paul's name. Only one thing destroyed them, and it was the thing they wanted most. There's a passage in the Orange Catholic Bible, used by the Fremen long before they followed Paul, that goes thus: beware the prayer that is answered. For the gods test their servants by giving them what they ask for, and the answered prayer is often the harshest judgment of all. Pardot Kynes prayed for green. Leto Kynes prayed for green. Stilgar, in the privacy of his heart, even Stilgar prayed for green because he was a Fremen and Fremen had been praying for green for 1,000 years. The prayer was answered. The desert is gone. Arrakis is now an ordinary planet with ordinary cities, populated by ordinary people who carry ordinary surnames that used to belong to a tribe of legendary warriors. You can visit it today as a tourist, and you will see no Fremen, because the Fremen do not exist anymore. They achieved everything they ever wanted, and in achieving it, they became what they had always feared most. They became unnecessary. The desert, perhaps, has the final word, because in the long dreams of Leto II, the tyrant who ruled for 3,500 years and saw further than any prophet, there is a vision that recurs. He sees the desert returning. He sees Arrakis, centuries after his death, drawing out again. He sees the worms growing back. He sees, perhaps, a new people emerging from new Sietches in a new desert. Whether they would be Fremen, in any meaningful sense, is the question that haunts every reader of the Chronicles. Probably not. Probably they would be something different, something the universe has not yet seen, forged by a new mush-mush that history cannot predict. But the lesson would be the same. The lesson the original Fremen learned at the price of their existence. That a people is not their gestures. A people is not their songs. A people is not even their language or their gods. A people is the pressure that shaped them. And when the pressure ends, the people end.